Marley was dead. There was no doubt about that. Or Marley was dead as a doornail. Welcome to another one of St. Mark's videos, our vlogs, and we have been through Christmastide the last couple of weeks, and we talked about the Nativity and about Mary and Joseph. Now we're in Epiphany, and Epiphany is the time of the church year where we means to manifest, reveal, when God revealed himself to man through Jesus. And we will study Epiphany. We'll talk about the Magi. We'll talk about baptism of Jesus. We'll talk about the wedding at Cana when Jesus performed the first miracle. And those are things coming up. When God reveals himself through Jesus, and Jesus reveals himself to us. But today I'm going to kind of go back a little bit towards Christmas. It's actually going to be an Epiphany lesson, but using a Christmas character. And I'm going to suggest that the character I talk about today actually has more influence on the way we practice and understand Christmas or the Christmas celebration in England and in this country than Mary and Joseph do. Now, if I had more time, I'd go in to try to explain what I mean by that. I think to try to give a pretty good argument for it. But I'm going to introduce today's character with the words bah humbug. And when I say bah humbug, everyone, from the small children to any adult, knows exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the character from A Christmas Carol written by Charles Dickens back in 1843. The fellow's name's Ebenezer Scrooge. So what can we learn from Ebenezer Scrooge about Epiphany? Hopefully I can explain that to you. Let's go back to the time in which Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. This was the 1840s. Not a good time in England and Europe, particularly for the poor working class. This was during the Industrial Revolution, and the people who owned the capital and owned the mills and all during the Industrial Revolutions came up with an idea a couple of generations back. They realized the most profits they could make was by using the cheapest labor, and that's pretty basic. But the cheapest labor were children. You know, they didn't have to pay them as much as adults, and they could. Children at very young ages went to work, and they had no choice in this thing. In these terrible conditions. This was also the time of the Irish potato famine, and the Irish potato famine killed 1 million people in Ireland, and probably many hundreds of thousands more migrated from Ireland to the United States at that time. But the Irish famine potato actually spread through most of Europe, and it was man-made. The conditions of that, it was a man-made disaster. Things were so bad that there was an Anglican cleric who was also an economist named Thomas Malthus, and he actually came up with these thoughts and proposed that because when there was prosperity, the population would grow, but when the population got to a certain point, that the natural way of balancing this was through disease and famine, that to reduce the number of people so that there would be a balance in the economy. Things got so bad that by 1848 there were several revolutions in European countries. None of these overthrew the government, but there was a lot of protests and a lot of dissent, and there was actually some fighting in France and Austria, Germany, Hungary, and in Italy. And there was a lot of discontent in England, where Dickens lived. The working classes were really fighting for more economic rights because of the disparity at that time. England, the disparity really existed a great deal, and the government of England responded by building workhouses for the children and orphanages and prisons for people who, could not pay their bills. So this was a terrible time. Now, during this time, the early 1840s, there was a report that came out called the Report on Child Labor in England. And it was really a gruesome reality, and how children were mistreated this time. Now, one person who read this report about child labor was Frederick Ingalls. And Frederick Ingalls was so moved by this that he studied into it more. Then a couple of years later, his response was that he partnered with Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto. And unfortunately, the Communist Manifesto turned out to be very accurate in some of its economic predictions about what would happen over the next several decades. Now another person who read this report, was very much moved by this, was the writer Charles Dickens. Now, Charles Dickens had very personal experience was this: when he was 12, his father was very much in debt, and the father and the rest of the family had to move into a debtor's prison. And Charles Dickens had to go out and work in one of these factories. He worked in a blackening factory for several months doing the same. But finally, his father inherited some money, was able to pay off the debts, and Charles Dickens was able to be reunited with his family and continue going to school. But there's very much of an influence on some of his writings and Oliver Twist and many other of his works later on. But his whole life lived around the orphanages and the workhouses, and was very aware of what was going on. Also, another thing going on in England in the early 1840s, this time where the proposal of these blue laws. Now, blue laws are when they shut things down on Sunday. Well, there were many wealthy Christians in Parliament who were trying to pass these blue laws to keep the Sabbath holy. They were going to close businesses to keep the Sabbath holy. We say, well, what's wrong with that? Isn't that the Christian thing to do? Well, what's wrong is in England at that time, and not just in London, but all the villages around there, the poor workers in England, the places where they lived were not safe to cook in, to have ovens, because of potential of fires and all. So the practice was that on Sundays and other holidays, the bakeries, after they would finish the morning baking that day's breads, they would keep their ovens going, and the people, the working class, would take their food, their meals to the bakery and cook them in the ovens. This was very kind of the bakers to do this, but they cooked in the ovens, and this was the only warm meals that most of the people of England received during the week, because the bakeries, the other 6 days they were working on Sundays, they would do this, or they could go to other businesses where there was some form of entertainment, and they could do this on their only day off during the week. Well, the blue laws, were suggested by the Christians that would actually have taken away this practice. They would have closed the bakeries and closed the places of entertainment and eliminated the only source that the working class really had for some entertainment. And they were doing this in the name of God. This was a Christian proposal of this. Well, the response to this, particularly for the mistreatment of children and other factors, Charles Dickens decided he would use his writing talents to do something about it. So he proposed he was going to write a pamphlet. And the pamphlet, the title of it was An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. Let me repeat that: an appeal to the people of England on behalf of the poor man's child. Now, I'm certain that Charles Dickens could have written a great pamphlet. It would have been very persuasive. It would have been very reasonable and appealing to the intellect, and reason of people. But Dickens came to the conclusion after he started writing this pamphlet that what would make a better impress would be a story. Much like Jesus used parables, Dickens decided that a story would reach more people and convince more people than this pamphlet would. So in a very short time, in a few weeks, legend has it, Dickens wrote a short novel called A Christmas Carol, which we're all very familiar with. Now, I love A Christmas Carol. It's all of us know what it is. I read it, frankly, a long, long time ago, but I've seen several movie versions of it. And to be honest with you, my favorite is The Muppets Christmas Carol. I watch that quite regularly. I find it very entertaining. And, we are familiar with this. Regardless of the movie, regardless who plays Scrooge, probably the book did the best job of describing Scrooge that any movie can. In the book, it describes Scrooge as he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. I love that phrase, at the grindstone. A squeezing, retching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. And in the first part of the book, we all remember the sound when people some gentlemen approached Scrooge about donating some money to help the poor, the needy. And what Scrooge does, he actually quotes or paraphrases Thomas Malthus, the economist I quoted a little while ago, who said that actually that people starving, famine, and disease would reduce the population. And Scrooge actually says if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. So bah humbug, as Scrooge says. Actually, bah humbug meant that something was a fraud. It was a hoax or a fraud, what he was referring to in that. So it's Not exactly what we think it is today. Well, A Christmas Carol is divided into 5 parts called staves, and we're most familiar with the third stave, which is when Scrooge meets the ghost of Christmas Present. And Ghost of Christmas Present takes him around and shows him things that are currently going on. Now, one of the things they witness are people going to the bakeries. They're taking their food to the bakeries so they can warm their food and have a hot meal on Christmas Day. And Scrooge sort of challenges the ghost. Now, the ghost is more of a spirit, or some people even say they're gods. But this Ghost of Christmas Present is a very large creature. And Scrooge challenges him and says, look at what these people are having to do, to eat. He says that, won't what you're doing hurt them? These blue laws. And the spirit argues back and puts it back on Scrooge and says, this is a quote from the book, there are some upon this earth of yours that claim to know us and to do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, evil, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are strange to us. They charge their doings on themselves and not us. And basically what I was saying is, don't blame God for the bad things that you do, as many Christians trying to justify these blue laws do this. So, the ghost says, don't blame us, what you do in the name of God. Now, the most dramatic part of stage 3 is right towards the end when the ghost, who's a large gentleman wearing a very long robe, reveals at the bottom of the robe, he pulls it back, and there are 2 children there. And these children were very deprived. They look like they're very much in need of want. And he looks at the children, and the children it's a boy and a girl, and they look like they're starving. They look like they're very frightened. And Scrooge says to the ghost, he says, "Spirit, are they yours?" And the spirit replies to Scrooge, he says, "They are man's." Says, "This boy is ignorance, and the girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all, beware the boy. For on his brow I see that is written doom, unless this writing is erased." And then the ghost very dramatically points towards the city in the background and says, society will suffer unless unless you do something about this. So, we're back that the ghost is predicting that the children growing up with no choice, the children had no choice but to live in ignorance and want, and with the result would be the run of society. So, Dickens has written that the state's response of workhouses and prisons was not humane. But Dickens writes about this not for what the state should do, but what individuals such as Scrooge can do or should do to help these children and to change the inevitable future that will come. So, it seems that in our society now to call someone a Scrooge is an insult. In fact, it is, because a Scrooge is someone who is cold-hearted, who doesn't care about people, but especially the needy. But the actual story, after the 3 ghosts, transport Scrooge really through some type of hell. It's very painful for Scrooge, but they don't do this for punishment. Although it's very painful, it's not for punishment. The 3 ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future tried to show Scrooge a better way of living, show him a better way that life can turn out, to make Scrooge aware, to liberate Scrooge, I would suggest, from his hard-heartedness. So that's the story. The story is, that Scrooge is transformed. At the end of the novel, Scrooge is transformed. Scrooge is redeemed. And Scrooge, to use the Jesus term, is born again. So if we think of the end of the story, calling someone a Scrooge is no longer an insult, but it's really a big compliment because Scrooge has changed his heart. So the message that we have for this Epiphany is we worship a God who believes in redemption. We worship a God who believes that no matter what we've done, and no matter how hard-hearted we are or have been, no matter what evil we've done, we can be transformed. God believes that we can be redeemed and that we can be born again. So, 2,000 years ago, God sent a message. God sent a revelation, a manifestation. God sent an epiphany. God sent Jesus. And God sent Jesus to teach us that we can be transformed, that we can be redeemed, that we can be born again. In 1843, Charles Dickens wrote to remind a Christmas Carol to remind us of that. So let's enjoy A Christmas Carol, the story and the movies and all that we watch, but let us learn from it that first, we have the responsibility to protect children from ignorance and want. But also, in this Epiphany, what's more important is that let us learn and know that no matter how bad we are, God sent Jesus to reveal and teach us that we, like Scrooge, can be born again. Thanks be to God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.